everyone, this is Professor Hall, and I'm going to be typing up some notes for you guys today. This is something that I do in my in person classes. Sometimes I have PowerPoints, like the ones that are in each unit for you guys, and other times I type up notes so that people can take notes and so I can explain things a little bit more clearly than I can with fancy PowerPoint bullets and pictures and things like that. So, what we're going to be talking about today is how to write a literary argument. Now, depending on what works best for you, you can write along with me and take notes, or you can just watch this video. What I would like you to do, however, is when you are finished watching this particular video, there are two videos after this that look at different student papers and that talk about some of the positive things the students have done and some of the not so positive things that students have done. And I'd like you to watch those after this so you can get a good idea of what I'm looking for in the papers and what I expect. So, how to write a literary argument. Now, if you took college composition, you probably learned that the basics of argument include a claim, reasons, and evidence. If you learned that before, it's a nice refresher. And if you did not learn that, congratulations, we're going to go over it now. So, in a class like college composition, your claim is going to be a statement which shows what side of the argument you have taken. So, for example, let me number this. There we go. For example, you might have, let's say you're making an argument about smoking, and your claim, the side that you're on, is that cigarettes should be illegal. Now, this is different than an opinion because of the next two parts of the argument. An opinion usually starts with an I statement, and it's going to be something like, I think cigarettes are gross. I don't feel like people should smoke. That's just how I feel, right? It's not backed up by anything. So the second part of the argument are the reasons. And reasons are statements of logic which support the claim. A lot of times you can think of adding the word because on here. So, one reason is smoking cigarettes has been linked to cancer, even secondhand smoke can be harmful to those around the smoker. So those are two reasons. They're not maybe the strongest reasons in the world, but they'll do for our purposes right now. The third piece of this type of argument is evidence. And evidence are pieces of research which prove the reasons. So in college composition, we talk about all different types of evidence. You can have personal experience, you can have facts, you can have studies, statistics, quotations from experts, and then let's say examples, and a number of other things too. But those are some basic things that you would look up to prove the reasons that you have just stated. Again, you can kind of see how this would build a strong argument, because if you have just your claim and your reasons but nothing to back it up, that's also going to be a problem. Cigarettes should be illegal because secondhand smoke can be harmful to those around the smoker. And then if you said that, someone would maybe say to you, prove it. So the reason that we can prove it is because so many studies have been done, right? So someone might say, as their evidence, according to a research study conducted in 2018, 85% of smokers experience negative health effects, including but not limited to cancer, emphysema, and asthma. And let's say that comes from somebody with the last name of Jones, and it's on page 4 of their research. Okay, so now I have all 3 parts of the argument. And again, if you took regular college composition, you probably talked about this quite a bit. There's a little bit of a difference, though, when it comes to talking about literature. So, our question here is sort of what makes a literary argument different? In a literary argument, you're still going to have a claim. And your claim, when you make an argument about a piece of literature, your claim is going to be a statement regarding how a piece of literature, so for this class, that's short stories, poems, plays, how a piece of literature should be interpreted. And it's all about the interpretation. And this is where sometimes people come in and they'll say, like, about poetry, well, I hate poetry because it just means whatever you want it to mean. It really doesn't. I can't look at a poem about a rose and say that it's about a fire truck, right? There's no evidence for that. So that is one of the ways that a literary argument, especially, you have to have evidence. You have to have things from the text that support your claim or your interpretation. So I'm going to have a claim here about the story that you read for this week, A Rose for Emily. Now, if you noticed, A Rose for Emily uses first person plural narration to emphasize that the entire town has isolated and ostracized Emily. An example of this, when you read the story, if you haven't yet, you'll see the narrator saying, we in the town. They use the word we. They'll say things like, us men went down, we women were standing around, those kind of things. So it's an interesting story, I think, because it's not just one person talking. It's a group of people talking. And my claim here is that Emily is isolated and ostracized, and the story is using that narration to emphasize her isolation. So next would come my reasons, and reasons are again going to be examples from the text that support the claim. So a little bit different. Sometimes they're statements of logic, but not as much as if you're arguing about something. Let's say you're arguing about smoking or global warming or something like that. So my example here, I will say the narrators explain that none of the men in the town are interested in Emily romantically, and none of the women in the town are her friends. instead of pitying her, or I'll move down here so you guys can see this better. Instead of pitying her or becoming friendly with her, they take pleasure in her pain and enjoy the fact that she never marries. So I have there some examples, and those examples are directly connected to my claim up here about first person narration. This is one of the things I think sometimes that I see with papers. I'm just highlighting a few things. First person plural narration. So I've mentioned here the men, and I've mentioned here the women, and then I have the idea that they're taking pleasure in her pain. Right. Then this is, I think, sometimes for people the most difficult part. The third part is the evidence. When you are choosing your evidence, you want to make sure that you have examples from the text, quotations from the text, which prove your reasons. A lot of times, what I get here is people really not giving me examples from the text that actually prove their reasons. So sometimes I think they'll pick a quotation, but not one necessarily that ties into their claim. So that's something to watch for in your own papers. Is the quotation that you're picking something that proves your claim? One of the other things too, just to explain, when I say a quotation, you are quoting the text in some way. Sometimes when I've said this, people have gone and looked for quotation marks where there's dialogue. It does not necessarily have to be dialogue. Here it is, because the narrators are talking and I'm trying to talk about narration. But there does not necessarily have to be dialogue. You're just quoting a piece of the story. So, my example, the men say, and now I've gotten a quotation here that I've copied from the story. So I'm going to paste this in. Here I should put the narrators. The narrators say, we remembered all the young men her father had driven away. And then later on they say, when she had gotten 30 to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. And then I have my citation, Faulkner, and that was on pages 5 to 6 of the story. So here is, again, a little bit of a difference in a literary argument. And you have another piece after the evidence, and that is called the analysis. And in the analysis, you need to explain for your reader how the evidence, how the quotation proves your claim and your reasons. And you need to interpret and explain the author's words. The author's words. There we go. So, why is this necessary? For a couple of reasons. The first being, as your teacher, I need to know that you understand the quotation. And if you had anybody else reading the paper, they might not have read the story. They want you to dig into it further. Leaving it just here is what a lot of people do. So sometimes people struggle with finding a quotation. A lot of times, and you can see this in the papers that I have for you later on, people just leave out the quotation. So they'll have the reasons and the evidence and a lot of explanation, but no, I'm sorry, the claim and the reasons and a lot of explanation, but no actual evidence. Every time you do a journal entry or a discussion board post, you need to be including evidence from the text to support your claim. And then you need to analyze and break apart that evidence and explain it. So what'll be interesting, I think, is that when you look at other people's papers, you can see sometimes people pick the same claims, but they analyze them a bit differently. Or sometimes people will have a little bit of a different interpretation than what you had. And that's where I think, at least, I think English is interesting because of that. So, our analysis here, as an example, some of the narrators remember that they're in the town, right? So some of the narrators were most likely the young men who were driven away because they were not good enough to marry or date Emily. Now, they would have called it courting back then, but that's fine. Therefore, they feel vindicated that she is still single. The word vindicated is interesting. Vindicated can mean, I can put the quotes there, can mean that a person feels justified in their beliefs, but it can also have, it has sort of a connotation. Connotation means those things that we associate with the word. Um, there's a connotation that a person is somehow kind of like getting revenge by being right. And you don't have to look this up in the dictionary. You know, if you go here and you right click a word, you can go to synonyms. All these things kind of come up. You can see what I'm saying here with vindicated: correct, right, justified, blameless. They're not to blame. Another one, if I do the thesaurus, I think it says something cleared, exonerated. They're rationalizing that what they're doing is right. So they're vindicated, and they're kind of getting revenge by being right. So here, it's clear that the town doesn't just ignore Emily, but they feel happy about her misfortune in some way. Um, One of the things you have to know about poems and short stories, plays to a certain extent, but particularly um, short stories and poems, the writer has only so many words to say what they want to say, so every word really counts. William Faulkner picked the word vindicated for a reason. So he didn't just say, we felt right and happy that she was miserable. No, they felt vindicated. Like they wanted, I don't know, somehow like revenge. So she rejected them, town, when they were younger, and now they are in turn rejecting her now that they're older. If you hear anything in the background, it has just, a thunderstorm has just started. Great, while I'm recording this. So that's basically how you would set up a literary argument. We have our claim, first person narration to isolate and ostracize Emily. The men are not interested in her. The women in the town are not her friends. They all take pleasure in her pain. The quotation, where I've used again the part about being driven away and not exactly pleased, but vindicated and feeling righteous and justified. And then I have my analysis, where I use words like rejected, and revenge and misfortune, so that you kind of see how these three things are linked. When we look at the paragraph as a whole, I did kind of a little rough draft of this, so I'm going to go and copy and paste it in. And I've put it in regular 12-point font. There we go. And it's double spaced. So you can kind of see, I'm going to zoom out here for a second. When you look at the page as a whole, this is a little bit longer paragraph because I'm a professor, so I tend to write a little bit more. But your paragraphs should be about like this, about a third to a half of a page. And if you have a second point, make a new paragraph. If you find that your analysis is kind of repetitive, cut some of it and don't have quite such a long paragraph. But you really should have about a third to a half of a page for each paragraph if you're doing a literary essay. One of the reasons I wanted to show you this is because I want to talk just a moment about two things. Number one, when I have this quotation, I have introduced the quote, and then I'm actually giving two short quotes here. You can just have one normally, but I have two short quotes. I'm going to put that in blue. And then I also have the citation here. And this is how you need to do your quotations. You should always introduce your quote, and then you have your quote, and then you have your citation. So other ways to start quotes are things like the author writes, or the narrator describes. You can have things like that. So words like explains, states, says, etc. You have to introduce it. If you don't, it's called a dropped quotation. The other thing that I would like to show you here is you can see the part, and I guess I'll highlight because I use the words again here, which you do not have to do all the time. I just did for our purposes. I have in total about 2.5 sentences here that are quoted. And one of the things I would like you to remember is having this balance. I'm going to delete this out for a minute. Really, the rule is that for every one line of quotation, you need 3 lines of your writing. So it's a 1-to-3 ratio here. Now here I have about 7 sentences total, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, I have 7, and I have about 2.5 lines, which is about right. So my ratio here is 2.5 to 7, which I guess if you were going to do the math, 2 to 6 would be about right. 2 lines of quotation, 6 lines of my own, 3 lines of quotation, 9 lines of my own, and that's about it. I don't want, like I said, sometimes people don't put in quotes at all, and that's kind of a problem. And other times people put too many quotations in. So instead of having that really good analysis that we get in this paragraph, we just have quote and quote and quote and quote. So we have something like, the men said, we all remember the young men her father had driven away. And the women say, us women thought blah blah blah. And another time the men say, we men think blah blah blah. Yeah, you don't need all of that. I really want you to do rich, deep analysis. And a lot of times on your papers, I will just write, dig deeper, go deeper. Don't do a surface analysis. Dig into those words and tell me what they mean. So when you have, that's how you do a literary argument. When you have a literary essay, you're going to be putting these little literary arguments kind of together. And I actually think that what I have given you for your second paper, for the drama paper, is a bit easier. Your first and third ones are going to be what we call explications. And an explication, you make a claim about about the author's message to the audience. Message is not necessarily the moral of the story. It's just something that the author wants the audience to think or believe or know. By the end of the story. And with that, with that explication, your reasons are going to be literary elements. Now, if you looked at the other PowerPoint where I talk about literary elements, which I hope you did already, the literary elements are kind of like things like characterization, motif, which is a repeated element, um, symbolism, personification in poems, figurative language, plot devices, things like that. So the literary elements which develop the themes and message of the work. And then your evidence is going to again be quotations that you will then analyze. So one of the things I like to tell people is that in your introduction, you should have the author's full name, and then later on you use the author's last name. They're not your friend. Don't use their first name ever. So the author's last name, the title of the piece that you're looking at, and then your thesis, which should be your claim and your reasons. Your body paragraphs are going to be a little bit different. Kind of what we've been talking about. For this, I like to tell people use the Teal method. So, what is the Teal method? T is topic sentence. E is going to be that evidence, quotations. A is your analysis. And then L, and this is how it differs a little bit from when you just do your journals or your discussion boards. L is going to be linking to the next point. Sometimes this can be a transition, but I didn't want to write T. Okay, so one of the things to remember is that all of your paragraphs should link back to the thesis. They should connect. I'll use the word connect since I just used the word link before. But they should all connect to the thesis in some way. If they don't, then you need to cut the paragraph or rewrite the thesis depending on what you need. But if they don't connect, that's going to hurt your organization. So I'm going to make a claim here about the other story you read, which is Cathedral. So I'll have my claim and my reasons. In the story Cathedral by Raymond Carver, the narrator, Bub, has an emotional catharsis. That means like an outpouring that kind of changes you and transforms from a callous, uncaring husband into a man who has who is more sensitive. The author's message is that people should open their eyes to new experiences, and that bigotry can be overcome by how do I want to put this? Bigotry can be overcome through the new experiences. Okay. Again, if I had more time, I kind of would revise that a bit, but you get the idea. I've given you a little bit of an explanation of the story, told you about the author's message. You will notice in these examples, hopefully you will notice, I'm not just recapping the story. This is another mistake sometimes people make. I've read the stories. I don't want you to give me a summary of them. I really want you to just analyze them and break them apart and kind of tell me what they mean. So that's my claim and reasons. My topic sentence for, that's my claim. My reasons are the author develops this, the message through the elements of motif, tone, and symbolism. Okay, so I'm going to highlight, there's my claim, there are my reasons, boop, right like that. So topic sentence. Poetry is a motif, again, a repeating element, something that pops up over and over. It's not a theme, but the word poem is used 11 times in the first 2 pages of the story. So poetry is a motif used early in the story to demonstrate Bub's insensitive nature. The word, I'll put what I just said. The word poem is used 11 times, and each time Bub uses the word, his tone is sarcastic and bitter. Now, I'm kind of tying together 2 of the reasons, motif and tone, but I probably would go more into tone later on. Poetry is a motif used early. This is really my topic sentence. I've got a bit more about it in the second sentence, just as kind of a little explanation. But that's really my topic sentence. My evidence, Bub's wife writes a poem about her blind friend, and Bub says, introducing quote, I didn't think much of the poem. Of course, I didn't tell her that. Especially, you'll notice, because they were first dating. So, Carver, and it was on page 2. And my analysis. So the analysis here, I probably would go into more depth than this if I were actually writing a paper, but I think poetry is sometimes associated with sensitivity. However, not everyone who is insensitive hates poetry, right? I think the more important thing is what the more important thing here is Bub's dismissal of his wife's poems. Because really, if you read the story, she is trying to communicate something to Bub, but he rejects her experience and kind of looks on it with disdain. So we have our evidence, a quotation here, just to vary the yellow and green, and then a little bit of an explanation. And again, I've used some keywords, insensitive, which I also had in my topic sentence, right? The fact that he's rejecting her experience. So basically, as part of the analysis, but as a way to kind of link it, the poem described how a blind man touched the wife's face, something Bub is repulsed by. Now, the way that I would link this is that my next topic sentence, I'll put TS for topic sentence, I would say touching is another motif used in the story. And then I would kind of go into that, right? So you can kind of, hopefully, see how this would all go together when you're writing a longer essay. If you have just one paragraph, you can just do this T part right here, topic, sentence, evidence, and analysis. If you have a journal entry, or if I've just said, write one paragraph for a discussion board and then make a couple comments, that part would be fine. But if you have an essay, you really want to make sure that you do this link part, link to the next point, and have those transitions to kind of connect things together. So that is it for this lesson. So that is it for this lesson. It took a tiny bit longer than I wanted it to, but I hope that you learned something and you can move along to the next video. Thanks.